Of beginning. It's a moment of going back to beginnings. As once again we begin the Torah, and with that physical movement of rolling the Torah right back to the beginning, and moving back to the beginning of time, in a sense before time starts. And then in another sense, time is already underway by the time we start. Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning. In the beginning immediately implies that there is already a system in place. But then we hear what was there in the beginning. There was actually tohu vavohu. There was just a confusion. I think Everett Fox translates it welter and waste. It's a kind of nice meaning, just absolute mess. Tohu vavohu, the choshech, and there's darkness, and there are the deeps, and they are sinister deeps because they're full of darkness. They're unknown deeps, and that's all there is. And God is alone with that. I noticed I was hypersensitive as we read it in Shul last week, Parshat Bereshit. The words had such power. I was shaking. It was really, perhaps as I get older, I get more sensitized. So something so powerful and so simple about the way the story is told. And then what do we have immediately after that is God's first act. Before that, he just is. And we don't really know anything about it. We know there's going to be a creation. The classic translation of Bereshit is in the beginning of the creation, of the time when God created. So we know we're embarking on that project. And there is God. God actually isn't there yet. And then suddenly, after the description of the deep, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or. It's the first words are, let there be light, which is not exactly an action. That's words. God speaks. Vayhi Or. And so we realize that words are action. That when God speaks, it happens. And so there's some power in speech, in God, in divine speech, that perhaps you might not have taken into account. And then Vayar Elokim et haor ki tov. What was the first act of God? And I want to emphasize this. It was the act of seeing. Not creating. He spoke. That's what he did. Speaking was creating. But the first act was to see, to turn his attention, right? To turn his eyes on the light, kitov. And he sees that it is good. There's tremendous power in those words. It's stronger than what happens thereafter when God sees each day's work and he sees that it is good. It's subtly different. There it's God, as it were, the great creator, checking out the latest consignment of creations, this day's work. And he looks at it and he says, good. Yeah, that passes muster. I like that. And moving on to the next. This first, Vayar Elokim Ki Tov, standing by itself, et or Ki Tov, gives us a sense of the goodness of light. A certain quality of attention by God to the light, Vayar, that God has to actually pay attention to notice. He could have got lost in the tohu vavohu. He could have focused on that in some way. Instead, he suddenly sees the difference that light makes. And it's a fraught expression. He saw it, he paid attention to it, and then he set it off and made a distinction between light and dark that had been before, as if darkness was there before God. The time priorities get a little bit confused. What is first? Well, the Shemayim va'aretz precede creation. He created in the beginning. God created. Before he can. So there's a feeling of time not quite gelling in our sense, and then God named the light day, and He named the darkness night, and it was evening and it was morning one day. Now, the usual form, of course, thereafter, after this, every day's work is going to be given an ordinal number. second day, third day of a series. Why doesn't it say first day? It's an obvious question. Yom Rishon. Why doesn't it say first day? And the answer that the Midrash gives, and I think Rashi quotes, is it was the day in which he was Yechido Shel Olam, in which God was solitary in the world. He was all there was. And that's the only day of creation in which he is solitary. As soon as he divides the light from the darkness, he embarks then on the second day in a radical division. He starts dividing up the wholeness of creation into parts. And that means already that there are things around him. He has a quantity of things around him, which in a way reduces that absoluteness of Yechido Shel Olam. There's no question that he is alone. There's nothing like him, nothing of the same order as him, but actually nothing, simply nothing. There is nothing there beside him. And then after that, we begin the whole movement, moving into the world of Vayavdel. Vayavdel, Vayavdel, Vayavdel. Every day, there are more distinctions and divisions and creating things as separate and differentiated objects. Yeah, until he finally gets to the creation of man, right at the end. Why does the second day not get the expression Kitov, which you have every other day? Why is it not called good? Why does God not name it as good? And the classic midrashic answer is that it's because on the second day, God creates the rakia b'toch hamayim. There's this mass of water, and the first major differentiation God makes is to put a rakia. Now, we're used to rakia in the modern sense, but Chazal address it almost in its mythic, primal sense. A rakia is it's a physical division. It's like beating metal till it's thin and making it cover the lower waters and divide between the lower waters and the upper waters, which were all one mass. And now the lower waters are somewhere down there, and it's called Eretz. It's part of the world, down there, Tachtonim, the lower world. And the Elyonim, the Shamayim, Mayim, is also fluid up there. And in between, there is this brazen plate. It's been beaten, hammered, right? Rakak, the idea of rakia. And it's there and it makes up. Now, as long as that's in place, there can be an eretz because there is a shamayim that's not mixed up with it. But now there's going to be eretz because the waters have been in a way deprived of their absolute totality. At the beginning, there was just total water. If you don't follow what I'm saying and if you feel like it should be clearer, please let me know. It takes me time to sort of get into the subject, so I think patience might help. So there is this sense of the majesty of being alone, and God deliberately then, in a way, cutting the world down to size, cutting it so that and creating many, many things in the world, even before he gets to man, to the human being, including in the end, of course, animals and creepy crawlies and birds and, all the buzz of life in the end, after having gone through the vegetation and the previous stages. Right? There is all that stuff in the world, and God is simply seeing that it's good. And that's all. It's a minimal gesture. It's like, yeah, next one. So Chazal come and say, and this is their way of reading the creation story. They place it in a context. After all, every ancient society has its creation stories. And everyone knows that. You're supposed to know that when you read the text. And they're not exactly history. They're myth. Call it myth. We say that it's not exactly myth. It has something mythic about it, but there's another dimension to it. It's not just, the stories of primal times, that has nothing to do with us. So what does the Midrash say? Classically, it's a Kabbalistic Midrash. Shehashem borei olamot umachrivan. That God as the creator is also the destroyer. God creates worlds and destroys them serially. That's what God did before he came to this world. So God had a history. He had a difficult history behind him of creating worlds and destroying them until he made this world, and then he said, this one pleases me. Each of the others he rejected. It doesn't please me. It's a very minor expression. No, it's not working. No. Like a creator, it seems to me, like an artist who tries out, the first version of the work. You write a poem, you're not happy with it. So you look at it, you don't even know what's wrong with it, in a way. It's not working. Out. And that's part of the creative process. So in other words, creation, rather sinisterly, because now we're talking about life, includes destruction. Destruction is part of the process, as in the artist analogy. That if you are not prepared to eliminate and to destroy and to feel displeasure, then you can never find your true pleasure. You can never find. Now, difficult idea. Yeah, doesn't sound particularly ethical. It's just that's God's pleasure. That's God's. It's almost aesthetic, the sense of no. And who knows? He might do it. He might change his mind about this one. So somewhere very deep emotional assumptions that we are experiences, which are human experiences that we're a little ashamed of. The way we go through relationships. Sometimes when we're young. Some people anyway. I like him. I don't like him. No. And right, that is a part of our lives. That's definitely part of our lives. Either we do it or we're done to. It's that's how it goes, and we're rather ashamed of it. That seems, that wasn't quite all right. It has to do with hormones. And, all right, we let it go. But actually, it's very much part of life, right? The treacherous part of life. The part that insists on having things right. And here, God takes on that persona, as it were. Somewhere there's that sense that Chazal aren't shy to describe God in this way. When it comes, of course, to this creation, it doesn't take all that long, although actually there is an estimate that it's quite a long time. We're talking about 10 generations of long-lived people before God brings a flood. So there's a list of genealogies, 2 actually, different lists. And then we get to Noah, and then we get to the announcement of the flood. And God says, Ani hineni mevi mabul. Behold, I am ready to bring a flood. And here, if you look at number, right, somewhere near the end, At any rate, what it says is that God says, I'm ready to agree with those who from the beginning, the angels up above, who thought it was not a good idea to create human beings. Human beings are very iffy. 5, thank you. 5. Yeah, there we are, Hineni maybe. Because of that Hineni, here I am is almost like I'm settling down now. I get to the idea of agreeing with the pessimists about human beings who ask, Ma enosh ketiskarenu. What is a human being that you should pay any attention to him? Your attention to the human is misplaced. They're not worth it. And I rejected that originally. I disagreed with my counselors up above, the angels. And now I'm tending to agree. Now, this is a very human description. Anthropomorphism really run rife. And you have it especially in the expression that you have just before the flood, where God says, it's a strange expression, Lo yadon ruchi ba'adam le'olam. It's Perik Tet, Pasuk Um, yes. Yeah. Pasuk. Vav. Nope. Not Pasuk. Yeah. I got it here. Pasuk Gimel. And God said, my spirit will not, so Rashi translates this, my spirit will not continue being ambivalent and struggling, Yitzra'em ve'yarivalai, constantly inner turmoil. I experience inner turmoil about the human. The human being really provokes me, really, really, there's something that God, maybe it's a kindred spirit. The human being is created in the image of God, after all. And this cannot go on forever. I have to make up my mind. It's really more or less like that. I have to decide. And that's when God decides to bring a flood on the world. That human evil is beyond bearing by now. That what has been accumulated is just impossible. Now, we are told some of the terrible things that human beings are doing, but not that much, actually. It's a general description. There was Hamas in the world. Hamas is not what you think, right? Hamas is simply violence, and Chazal understand it really, particularly as gezel, which sounds a little mild, but robbery, well, not so mild actually. Forcibly, seizing other people's property, see other people's things, and other people's wives, and having relations that are not according to nature, and all kinds of extras are added by the Midrash. This is the tradition, that there was total mayhem in human life, in the human moral life. And that's what led God to say, there's just no more to do with this. I can't go on wondering, should I im lehashchis, im lerachem? Right? God is of two minds, to destroy midat hadin or midat harachamim. And something very immediate about the description here. God is never so present as the dominant character in the story as in these two first parshiot. When it comes to Avraham, when we reach safe ground with Avraham, where Avraham begins to be able to do what pleases God, begins to have a different kind of relationship with God. When that happens, God recedes from the story. And we look at Avraham as if he's the hero of the story. Avraham is there, and we're interested in what he does, and his wife, and his children, and does he have children, doesn't he, and so on and so on. And God makes an occasional appearance, and that's the way it is thereafter, more or less. There are some places where God is even less in evidence, but at the beginning, it's all God. It's as if God is the hero of the story, and human beings are sort of the incidentals, and God is. And what I want to suggest is that the absoluteness of God's presence is really a way of talking about the absolute problem that human beings have with themselves. That human beings are in such trouble with themselves, with the too muchness of themselves, that every time something happens to them, every time there's a disaster of some kind, they have to immediately, their attention is drawn then to their condition, as happens when something terrible, lo aleinu, happens. Suddenly we become very aware of ourselves and our world and our inner conflicts. What is it we really want? Have to make decisions and so on. And somewhere at that point, God comes into the story. And there is a sense that God comes into the story in response to the trouble that's going on in the human world. Right? We'll see how this plays out as we go on. So all kinds of sins. There's murder on the one hand. There is dubious sexual activity, b'nei Elohim and b'not ha'adam, which some people translate, it's the sons of God, daughters of men. Some people translate powerful people oppressing unpowerful people, weak women, powerful men and weak women. So you don't have to say more than that. That power gone mad in the world. And that's under the heading of gezel somewhere, of just grabbing. it doesn't have differentiation. It doesn't have proper differentiation in the world. And the animals with each other and the animals with man, and it's that's the situation that we have then. And man now begins to multiply on the earth, and the daughters. Okay. And then we go into the first source on your page, number 1. And I just want to read one line from it. You can follow the rest yourself. There's very good translations provided here. What is this like? The story of Namabu. It's like a jar full of locusts. One locust rises up the side, climbs up the side, and falls back. The second one climbs up and falls back. The third one also climbs up and falls back. So it's a kind of fatalistic drama, an absurd drama of just, and what makes it absurd is, as the Midrash then says, the third one doesn't learn from the second one, and the second one doesn't learn from the first one. How is it that people don't learn from history? Why don't you look back and look what came before you, and see the mistakes people made then and learn from them? That very, very strong claim here. What is it to learn from other people? Apparently, that's what they should have been doing. And then this is applied to Dor Enosh and Dor HaMabul and Dor HaFlagah. Right, the flood wasn't the first flood, it turns out. Right? You may know this, you may not know this. Again, in the treasury of Midrash, Rashi quotes it, that in the time of Enosh already, there was a mini flood. It just destroyed a third of the world. A third. Threes are going to be important, not one. There shouldn't be just one in the world. There shouldn't be actually just 2, but 3. So bear it in mind. Destroyed a third of the world. Early warnings signal. It's a way of saying, watch out. I'm on the rampage. And they don't learn from it, right? They see what happened and they don't learn from it. And that is the whole point of the Midrash. And it goes on that the Tower of Babel later didn't learn from Dor HaMabul. Right? So we have but they're very different stories, surely. How can you learn from a generation, from a past history that seems absolutely different from you? They have very different problems. And how do I know what to learn? I find the idea of learning from other people, actually, I'm quite skeptical about it. But really, can one ever do that? What does one learn from other people, from seeing other people? Take a good example from other people. You'll be a role model. You'll be a role model for other people. What does that mean? You can only be a role model for yourself. You have your standards and you try to live up to them, or you fail to. But to look at someone else, what good does that do you? I'm asking a kind of childish question here, but I think it's important. How do we learn altogether? When Chazal say so simply, Rashi, Ze ba lelamed, quotes some difficult text and says, this comes to teach you, and then gives you the moral of the text. Is that so obvious? This is Chazal creating a meaning of the text, and often it's not obvious at all. And they're saying that's the teaching. In other words, the teaching is in a way a very personal matter. And what I think is the teaching is the teaching. I connect in some way with that generation or that other person. I feel myself in my too muchness. Am I being too much for myself? I connect with something I read about the past. And only once I've connected and see myself as identified with the person, in spite of the many differences, can I learn something that may not be obvious to other people. This is what I feel I would like to move towards. That moves me, that I see in the other person. So imagination plays a large role in this kind of learning. It's not an objective analytic thing. It's a form of attention that is looking for connection. That you pay attention to a previous generation, and you're looking for something, you're scanning for something that you can relate to. Now that would be to learn from, but of course there's negative kinds of learning from. Yaakov, I think I put it on your page in number 2. Yaakov says when he comes back from his many years with Lavan and he meets Esau, he says, Im Lavan Garti. I've been staying with Lavan. And then the Midrash does this amazing sleight of hand with the letters of the word Garti and makes them Taryag, right? Right, Taryag. I kept all 630 mitzvot. V'lo lamadati mima'aseh Esav. Now he is congratulating himself here for not learning from Esav. Sorry? From Lavan. From Lavan, yes, from Lavan. I didn't learn from him. In other words, in the sense that learning from someone is just imitating them, I didn't do that. But I did learn from him. I learned what not to do. And that's the kind of learning. It's not imitating. It's actually looking for what's different and what's the same. It's a combination. What's different about this person and what's the same, and I make use of both. This person is different from me. I really have different standards or desires. At the same time, I also have the same. How do I deal with that? Now that's complicated. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I can't really explain it any further. It's something you know about from an experience, perhaps. So what we have here then is these grasshoppers, these locusts, who just keep crawling up and sliding down helplessly and give God a sense of despair about the world, a kind of fatalistic sense, which is basically the human sense, that human beings are in despair about their world, that they're not enjoying this, this slide up and down. It's not good for them. And in a way, God is extrapolating the human experience here. And what we then have is what happens straight after the flood. I want to focus now on number 3. We read, after the flood, after God convinces Noah to go back to return to the real world, to come out of his ark, Vayachel Noach ish ha'adamah, and Noach began. There's frequent reference to that word lahachel, to begin anew. Noach began anew as a man of the earth. And what do we read there? That he plants a vineyard and he grows vines. Right, it's the end of Perek Chet, I think. Perek Chet. Yes, Perek Chet. Pasuk. We won't be doing such page turning so often after this. Yes, Pasuk Tet Chaf. Vayachel Noach ish adamah. He began to become a man of the earth. Vayita Karim. Vayita, Vayesht min hayayin, Vayishkar, Vayitgal betoch ha'olo, Vayarcham aviknan et ervat haviv, Vayaged l'shnei achav b'chutz. You have a story here of shame and disgrace, that he becomes drunk and he exposes himself, he's naked, and his son Ham mocks him, sees him, mocks him, goes and tells his brother, focuses his attention on the looks hard at his father's nakedness with all that it implies for him, the Oedipal tensions there. And he tells his brothers, and in other words, inviting him to join the show. And then Shem and Ham take a covering and walk backwards so that they're not looking at him. Their attention is turned away from him, and in respect for their father. So it's like a deliberate blocking of attention in order not to join in this process. So the becoming drunk, that's the first thing that happens after the Mabul, which means that Noach, in a sense, disappoints us. Here we have the beginning of a new world. He is saved. Ach, Noach. He is in a way alone in his world now. He has the chance to start again as the first human being. It's a tremendous responsibility. And it seems that he's a little bit resistant to it. God tells him, it's a very subtle point, God tells him when he's in the ark, the time has come, same in Hateva. Leave the ark. You and your wife and your sons and their wives and everything else. And the sages listened to the order of the words there. You together with your wife, your sons together with their wives. Pru uruvu v'shirtzu ba'aretz. What I want you to do now is to take your fresh oneness, your redeemed oneness. You are just the one little sliver, ach Noach, like a mere Noach is what was left in of the world. And to take that and start proliferating and spreading out horizontally over the whole surface of the earth. Shirtzu and swarm. Create a swarm of descendants. It's not even a human word. It's a word that describes the insects, the creepy crawlies and the birds of the air and the fish in the sea. Everyone's busy procreating. It has to do with making yourself many. And it also has to do, as Rashi says, with being very small, barely above the ground, barely emerging from the surface of the earth. You're a part of the earth world, right? And also moving in a kind of involuntary way. Rashi says, what is it? Lishrotz or lirmos is the other word for to swarm. It means these crowds of little beings that suddenly swerve in this direction, then swerve in that direction. And you feel they're being dragged by some force. They're not standing upright, as a human being in the world, making a decision. They're in mobs and masses. That's how they come. And they have a certain power, but they're also strangely lacking in that power that comes from the vertical. That comes from being a man standing up alone in the world. Now, that's the tension that I want to focus on from now on. Between the vertical and the horizontal, God says to Noach, to Adam, first of all, God says to him that I want you, pru uruvu umil ta'aretz. If you can look at the text, so number 4. He blesses him. It's a blessing. First, the first blessing, which is also the first commandment. It becomes a blessing that becomes a responsibility. I think the word responsibility is very important here. That it's a blessing, but it's not something that I sort of bathe in. Oh, what a lovely blessing! I'm going to have lots of children and grandchildren, and everything will be lovely. No, shirtzu is like insects. Now there's an ambivalence about that. There's a tension there. Do I want to produce shratzim? It had the same thing in Bnei Yisrael and Mitzrayim. Remember? The first sign that Paro's edict is not working is that in spite of his efforts to oppress them, Paro, V'ravu, V'yishurtzu, all the 6 expressions for swarming and teeming. There's another nice word in English. That word? T-E-E-M. Do you feel it? This teeming multitudes. There's life there, and there's movement, but it's somehow subhuman. It seems to be, and it's spreading out horizontally as if numbers are all that count. And that's God's blessing, and it becomes a responsibility. That is what you should do, not just let your lower selves find expression, but actually invest in that. There's a tension there. If man is created, b'tselem Elokim, and that seems to be right, it says at the beginning, God makes in his solitariness, speaks in the plural when he creates man. Remember? Na'aseh Adam, b'tsalmenu uv'tmutenu, kidmutenu. Let us make man. Now, who are the us? Traditional understanding, midrashic understanding, is the angels. God is humble, in v'tzanuto. And although he is singular and singular, completely singular, there is nothing like him in the world. There are these hosts of angels, and there again, in a way, a higher horizontality, if you know what I mean. Up there's also a horizontal, which is the courts of God. All these other creatures. What are they doing there? Why do we need them? We need them to demonstrate something about God, which is also true of human beings. And that is that being alone is lot of. Even for God. Now, that's the wrong emphasis, though. I take that back. It's not that it's not good for God. It's that God deliberately takes on the plural in order to make his decision somehow inclusive. He asks the angels, shall we make man? Right? There's a question in it. He consults. Nimlach. Nimlach means he allows himself to be ruled. It's passive of being a melech. To take advice. To take advice is to put yourself down. I'm ready to learn from you. This angel of justice, this angel of mercy, this angel of truth. Everyone stands for something different. And God doesn't speak, when it comes to the human being, he doesn't speak in the singular. He's ready to speak in the singular of everything else. But the human being is the most complex creation. And so a complex God comes and speaks at this point. And he speaks basically to his court, to himself, but not to the human being. To the human being, he just says, Pru uravu umilu ta'aretz. But the human being is in the image of God. We know that because it says it twice. When God is planning it and when he actually does it. Vayivra. So twice in the image of God. What does that mean, in the image of God? Have a look now at, yes, okay. To be, for a human being, to want to be more, to want to be, Elias Canetti has a book, Crowds and Power, in which he talks about the desire. It's almost an anthropology of human history. There's a desire of human beings to be many, because when you are many, you have power. You can defend yourself. Like the animals. That is, he looks at the animal world and he sees that we can't begin to compete with them for swarms and teams. Somewhere our procreative ability is much inferior to theirs. And there's a desire then to be more, to multiply in that direction. But there is also an understanding of a different modality, and that is the modality of being singular and high and lofty, and being in some way containing in oneself, right? Echad, right? Containing in oneself a kind of wholeness. But the mitzvah is to multiply, to be like the animal, what Canetti calls an increase pack, a pack that has a blind urge to be more, to move over the surface of the earth, to occupy space, and to fill out the world. Mil'u, shirtsu. And then on the other hand, there is that singularity. Have a look at Bachelard at the end of your source page. Gaston Bachelard. This is Bachelard number 12, the English source at the end there. This comes from one of Bachelard's many books. He's a philosopher whose philosophy is based on art and poetry and imagery, what he calls the material imagination. What human beings contain in themselves in their depths is images of various kinds. And here he talks about the solitude of a belfry tower. Think of a European tower with a bell at the top. And there's a man who watches other men running about on the distant square, bleached white by the summer sun. Looking down on these barely human-looking creatures, you can almost not see them in the sun-bleached square. The men look the size of flies, because he's so very high up, and move about irrationally like ants. A belfry daydream gives him the impression of domination at little cost. He doesn't have to actually do anything to dominate. It's just his position, which gives him a form of attention to the world, which makes the world very small beneath him. Right? He reduces the world, other people basically, to nothing. This is specifically the realm of high solitude from the top of his tower. A philosopher of domination sees the universe in miniature. Everything is small because he is so high. And since he is high, he is great. The height of his station is proof of his own greatness. Now that's the fantasy of the philosopher of domination. That's human beings walk around with that fantasy, even the most innocent-looking people. That I, in some way, I am it. I am the center of the universe. It's not a joke. It can be seen as humorous, but it's really not. It's very serious. I look out, down, in some sense. How do we counter that? Perhaps the only way of countering that is to become one of them, of the teeming masses down there. But who wants that? And so there needs to be a third possibility. Yeah. Your height and your greatness and your thinkingness, the fact that you are so full of lofty philosophical thoughts and you walk around in a daze the whole time and don't notice anything around you. Yeah. All that, I want to talk about it as a gendered reality. That's the masculine role as opposed to the feminine role, if you will, traditionally. That the man is the one who is involved with his work, and the woman is bustling around him down there, making sure that everything works in the household so that he can pursue his vertical. Yeah. Now we are in a much better position, I suppose, of now having two partners to the marriage who are split between the demands of verticality and the demands of the family, are you with me? Do you see what I'm saying? Right? We all live now under that strain to some extent or other. What am I? Am I, or am I actually all that down there? And there's a sense of the dangers of this. G.K. Chesterton wrote these Father Brown detective stories. Anyone ever see one of those? Anyway, one that stays with me from my childhood is that a person is found dead, murdered, only they can't find any idea. There's no murder weapon. There's a little toy mallet lying beside him. And Father Brown, in his wisdom, understands that someone stood at the top of the tower and just dropped that mallet, and with the power of gravity. What happens when you drop things from a height? They become murderous. And that's what murders the. So it's somewhere that stuck with me, that the danger of being that. And God's blessing as being that. But at the same time, B'Tselem Elokim, who is Yechido Shel Olam, who has that kind of detachment from all that. Now, different societies have dealt with the problem in different ways. There is in Christianity, there is a select group, the few, who don't marry and don't have children, and therefore are able to devote themselves solely to that dimension. But Judaism doesn't take that role and doesn't actually even regard it as a compromise, it seems. It regards it as a blessing. And it is a question. I think when one's been through it oneself, you go through it, and at certain points you ask yourself, is this everything I want? All this pru-revu v'shurtsu? It's not. And at the same time, it's essential. It is bracha. There is bracha, and then there is something else. And God creates the human being with these conflicts, with these internal uneasinesses of some kind. And what God does is mirror back. As soon as I feel my own too muchness, somewhere I look for God in it. In some sense, I connect with God right there in the painful place. Let's see how that works out. Kafka felt this problem very much. This problem of being like ants. And he wrote this. He wrote this in a letter to Phyllis, to whom he was engaged. And he she had a dream and she's worried about her dream. That's what a human being is. What did God create here? A human being is someone who dreams and is worried about his dreams, her dreams. That you don't regard them as just part of the jetsam of the night, kind of what you shed during the night, but you regard them as somehow questioning your very being. What am I about? And this is what Kafka writes to her. Had you not been lying on the ground among the animals, you would have been unable to see the sky and the stars and wouldn't have been set free. And he talks about the terror of standing upright. The terror of standing upright over the animals, of the terror of being the powerful one. It's a very Kafkaesque expression. It's not the pleasure of, it's the terror of being in a position where you can make others suffer, where others look to you with fear, or that whole domination relationship. That's a form of attention to the world that needs apparently two focuses. There is the view from up there, and there is the view from down there. Is it possible to have a third position? I wanted to say something here about forms of attention, because that's going to be our subject this year. Different ways in which one can look at things. Looking at things is not a passive act. It's not just allowing something to register on your lens, on the lens of your eye. Yeah. What are eyes? Eyes are, all right, certain things register, but also they're means of connecting with the world. Your eye seeks out and looks, the eye beam, in a way, looks to connect with what it looks at. And so there are very different ways in which human beings can look at each other. And one feels looked at, the gaze of the other can be a very unnerving thing. If the gaze is hostile or simply there to make use of you, kind of narrow focus, look at you, what can I do with you? What use can I make of you? You know that gaze. It exists, measures you up and down, especially when you're young. Whereas on the other hand, the gaze can be a way of making connection. What I use as a source book for all this, one of two books. One it's by someone called Anton Ehrenzweig, and his book is called The Hidden Order of Art. And I just want to quote one or two things he says. He talks about the different forms of attention. He says one is focused, narrow, you look at the details of things, and the other is diffuse and blank and wide. Another way of looking at things is not to look at the details of a picture. Let's say you're looking now at a picture. You can look at this detail, and see how they're placed in space and go into great differentiations. Or you can, in a certain sense, blur your gaze. It's not going to come like a needle. No, it's going to be blurred, almost as if you're absent-minded. You're not really focusing on anything. And then suddenly things come out at you. Then you see things, these puzzle pictures, find the dog in the picture. And it's a picture that's just full of dots. Next week, I'll bring in some actual pictures to show you, to help the imagination. And these are, they're such a relief. If you repress in some way all the obvious particular things, suddenly you get a total comprehensive view of the whole thing. And suddenly, there's that dog, that comes out. And then you can welcome it in a different way. It's not just something I have picked out, but it's there and I can relate to it. Now, these two forms of attention, he wants to say, are what go to create in the world. When we want to create something, when we are being creative, we have to use both faculties. We need to get the details right. We need to get the parts right. And I think you're creating a great composition, Beethoven. He has to have every detail right, but the large sweep of things also has to have a real presence there. And if you're too focused on the details, you will actually be dumbed down. You'll be blind to the large forces that are working their way through the wide stare. Sometimes distortion can lead you to understand something more deeply. One of my favorite little pictures is a cartoon. I don't remember the name of the cartoonist. He always puts the nose and the eyes in the wrong place. But he created a very vivid picture of a certain kind of creature. But I'll bring it in next week. There's no point. I also want to say one more thing about attention before we come back. And this is from a different extraordinary writer, Ian McGilchrist. Anyone read him? McGilchrist? No. He is a phenomenon. He's written 2 massive tomes in which he basically, he starts from the premise of the human brain and the animal brain as having 2 hemispheres. There's left hemisphere and there's right hemisphere. Now, there was a time when this was popular, this way of looking at things, and then it was very much despised. It was rejected as primitive and simply untrue. One is masculine, one is feminine, one is intellectual, one is emotional. No, out with all that. But he comes up with a much more sophisticated version of it, which is now in the latest brain research. He's studied the latest neuroscience. He's a psychiatrist who once was a literature buff. He had a doctorate in literature, and then he went on to do this. And he talks, for instance, about the bird whose 2 eyes represent the 2 halves of its brain. The right side of the brain is the left eye, and the left eye is the one that sees. I'll start with the left side. The left side of the brain, of the bird's brain, is in the right eye, and the right eye pecks at looks as he's pecking at the gravel to find the grain that he can eat. He's looking for food, and he needs to look in great detail with a very close focus. But at the same time, his left eye is out looking at the world, waiting for predators, watching out for. So if you want to be a bird, he says demurely, if you are a bird, then you want both to eat and to remain alive. So you can't actually allow either faculty full sway. You want both. And so it's almost like it's a comic picture of him. The bird, of course, the eyes are on different sides of the head. It's quite different from our way of looking. We have the advantage of depth vision because both our eyes are here. But we have the disadvantage of not having that clear division between the 2, right? And so in some way, it becomes even more of a strain, right? to exercise both parts of the brain at the same time. He wants to say that the master and the servant, the master of human life should be the left eye, the left hand, which is the wide one, which is the one that looks for meaning and purpose and connection and totality, looks for what's the allness of things. And the servant is the right eye, instrumental, looking for details, scrutinizing things very, very closely. But it has to be in some way ruled by, that would be a proper economy of, and it's the wrong way around now. His argument is a large historical argument. He thinks that since the 18th century, at least, we've got it the other way around. The scientific, empirical, close focus is the one that's dominant now, and we give very little credence to that kind of intuitive, large, comprehensive gaze. Okay, so we come back now to look then at Rabbi Akiva, who haya omer. Rabbi Akiva. Yes, number 6. Hu haya omer, Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. Precious is the human being who is created in the image of God. Chaviv really means, it really means special. This is it's a singular privilege, but it's in very Hamish language. Chaviv, adorable. I really love. Oh, you're so adorable. Right? You were created in the image of God. You're Chaviv Adam, Shenivra B'Tzelem. Chiba Yetera, even more precious, even more singular, even more is the person who is told, who is made to know that he's created in the image of God. No da'at lo. And no da'at lo is, it's not just that he didn't think up the idea. At the simplest level, it means that he was told. God told him. If you don't know about it, but you're created in the image of God, that's pretty good. That gives you a singular situation. But if you know about it, if it's in your consciousness that you're in the image of God, that is quite a different order of existence. Because why? Now that's my question. What makes it so different? After all, if you are a natural, you are a prince. So you in all your ways, in a sense, you enact that princeliness. I'm a child of God. I'm in the image of God, but I'm not particularly thinking about it. This is conscious, and what difference does that make? Who was the first human being who was told he was in the image of God?
Noah.
Hmm?
Noah.
Noah. Yeah. Look back to number 4. In the very same breath as telling Noah that he should multiply and reproduce and be swarm and team, he tells Noah, you are created in the image of God. I've created you in the image of God. This is Noah, who, you and all human beings, and your blood is not cheap. I will pay attention to anyone who sheds your blood, and you shall not shed blood of other people, because you are in this elevated, you live in this Noah is told, and what Noah knows at this point, who is Noah? Noah is someone who's in deep crisis, because he's just seen what can happen to the human being. That the human being in their myriads have now, been swept away in the floods. The human being is nothing. He's a grain of sand. He's an ant. It's no problem at all to destroy in there. It's that kind of, apocalyptic sense of things. And in that situation, the survivor of all that, lives with that destruction inside him, obviously, unless he's really insensate. And God then says to him, but that human being is created in the image of God. And you are the one sole survivor of this. And you now have to work out what that means. No, Da'at doesn't just mean he's given information. Da'at is not information. I would almost prefer to translate it as imagination. Right? It's the wide view. It's not a little piece of information, God, oh, by the way, you're in the image of God. Just note, please note. Right? It's nothing like that. What do you mean? It's more questions than answers to tell someone that. And now he's going to be left to digest that, to process that. What does that mean? How does that translate into my responsibilities? How do I now imagine that and live that reality? If I know that I'm actually just one of the creepy crawlies who happens to have survived, on the one hand, and the other hand, God has told me this. And so there is that now a real tension. I remember when I was a child, there was a photograph of my grandfather around, and my mother, who, that tragic period after the Shoah, my mother had left her family behind in Romania, and we were living now in Scotland. And she had this photograph of her father, whom she adored, an old, venerable man with a long white beard and saintly look. And she said, you are like him. And she said, you look like him or you are like him. I'm using that as an analogy, you see. And of course, I was completely mystified. What about different, completely different, nothing to do with me. But since I minded, I was noda'at. I paid attention to what my mother said. I didn't just laugh it off entirely. In its strangeness, it began to grow in me, and I began to wonder that the information makes you wonder, what does that mean? How can I see that as real for me? And eventually I did, eventually in the course of time, in a way that was very helpful and inspiring. I did come to some sense of what that might mean. Whether it's the sense that she meant, I don't know. But she was speaking intuitively. She knew him and she knew me. I wasn't in that position. So the only way one can learn from other people, seems to me, has something to do with that. Right? There's a piece of information that we have about other people, and it's double. And that is that they're both very different and that they are the same. Yeah. And that puts us then into a whole deep investigation, of oneself and one's relation with others. Okay, let's come back now. I want to now think for the half hour we have left about the Tower of Babel. What comes out after the flood? It sounds absolutely innocuous. It's impeccable. Nothing wrong with it at all. Vayhi, let's have a look at it. Perik Yud Aleph. Please do bring Chumashim with you if you can. Vayhi kol haaretz safa achat, right? This is after 10 generations later. Right?
1 minute, this
Pardon?
is the generation of Abraham?
No, not yes. No, it's actually we just had a genealogy there. No, I don't know. No, I take that back. I'm not sure it's 10. You have to count. You have all the generations just before. It's till Abraham, right? The whole world was safa achat, one language, udvarim achadim, one words, one things. Right? You have echad in the plural. Now, right, we're moving towards something that's not one and not two. Yeah. There was a kind of uniformity and a single language. So the culture, which is it's a live thing, the culture had an echad quality, kind of closed quality about it. It was one in a negative sense. It hung together, an ideology, let's say, that was completely closed to any other currents. That's one way of understanding it, at any rate. Okay, and where did they found their civilization? They traveled from the east and they found a valley in the land of Shinar, and they settled down there. And then they said to one another, Hava, let's get ready to do this. That's Rashi's translation. Hazminu atzmachem. Let us now, brace yourselves. Now we're going to engage in a real project. We're going to make bricks and we're going to burn them in the kiln. And then they had bricks instead of stones to build with. Why do we need to know all this technology? They didn't have stones, right? It's an interesting anthropological observation maybe, but that's not what the Torah is about. Why do we have to know that they didn't use stones, but instead they went to all the trouble of making and firing bricks? And then the chemar became chomer. So there's a lot of play on words here. Even, le'even, right? Levena, le'even, play on words. And then they said, Hava, again, let's now get ourselves all together and we'll build ourselves a city and a tower with its head in the heavens. And we'll make for ourselves a name, strange expression, pen nafutz. Somehow we'll create a solid a solid, cohesive reality, the name to it, and we will, lest we scatter over the face of the whole earth. What are they worried about? Behind this project, there is a defense. Somewhere, the end of the whole thing is pen nafutz. It seems to be very positive. Let's build, let's make, let's run. Technology, civilization, as high as it gets. Pen nafutz. There's a fear. Lest, and so the tradition is, Midrashic tradition is, lest we are again, if we scatter over the face of the whole earth, God can do it to us again. There can be a similar flooding, and there we will be again like insects spread out all over, weak and defenseless of the face of the earth. And here we'll build ourselves a vertical tower, which will make us impregnable. In fact, there is a suggestion of threatening God in some way. We're going to take over. Right? We are now going to take over from that God that we're basically afraid of. The God who has power to do the same thing again. So they are looking at previous generations. Certainly they're not ignoring history. They are looking at history and drawing a conclusion from it. Is this a good conclusion? And if not, why not? What's wrong with it? They set up a unified society, and this is almost like the highest achievement of human beings, to get together and live in a place where everyone speaks Esperanto. This is the dream. Everyone speaks one language. There's no possibility of misunderstanding, which is such a curse when you have more than one. When you have, you are never going to fully understand. That's the other person. So whatever you can learn, you're going to learn on the basis of not fully understanding. You're going to have to allow for the fact that my understanding is incomplete, but nevertheless, I have come to certain conclusions, and therefore I say I'm learning something. Perhaps we can do better than that. There's one language that is absolutely transparent. Meaning is transparent. What have you lost in such a society? So I want to look, first of all, at the Mer Shiloach, number 7. And then we'll quickly have a look at the Sforno and the Hamek Davar. For the Mer Shiloach, number 7, they were all of them intending to live in one place, that there should be no scattering over the face of the earth, thinking themselves less vulnerable to doom, to repetition in that. But where did they build this vertical civilization? They built it in a valley with its head reaching the heavens. Now, if you want to create a tower with its head top very high, perhaps you should start on a mountain. Valley is not the best place to start. But they choose a low place, kind of lowest common denominator. That's what they're going to. And then there's a horrific midrashic reference here that Shinar, the name of the place, is a pun. It's punned Shenin Arusham Kol Mete Hamabul, that all the corpses of that nightmare flood that's in their bad dreams now, all the corpses had been shaken down to this lowest place in the world. So again, there's this physical, geographic imagination. When you talk about low and high, there's a place that's the lowest of the low, which is the place of impacted death. That's the place of pure terror down there, with all the demons, all the bodies and the demons down there. And that's where they choose to set up their civilization. Why? He puts it in a way that it's very suggestive. He says, on the one hand, they want to exploit the fact that human beings are mortally afraid for themselves, and they're afraid of the gods and the power of the gods, and that is the basic religious impulse. What leads human beings, right, classically to worship gods is out of a sense of our vulnerability and that gods can do anything they want with us, death, everything that one witnesses in the world. And that is the basis of religious experience. And that's what they represent, the kind of primeval religious impulse, the fact of death, and then the need in some way to placate the gods or to attack the gods or in some way to deal with this in an unequivocal sort of way. But the irony is that what they're actually doing, and he puts it in a paradoxical way, he says, we want fear to be simply visceral in us so that we don't have to actually cultivate a genuine fear of God. A genuine fear of God is not helped if you have an overwhelming visceral sense of terror. A genuine fear of God goes along with love of God, a sense of being different from him and also like him, right? That sense of being in the image of God, but at the same time, yishritzu, the high and the low. And that can only happen if you build in a high place, like the Beit HaMikdash, he says, which is the opposite. The unity you had, that this generation had, was not the unity that God likes. God, that's against Ratzon Hashem. Achdut shehu neged Ratzono shel hamakom. It can't last. Because what does God want? God wants a unity that is experienced by human beings who come together, who create a society which is based on the attempt to grow, not to sink to the lowest possible, but to grow with a real fear of God and a real love of God, right? A real sense of what the relation between me and the other might be. Now, that is they've cut this off from themselves by choosing to camp there with their civilization. Now that's the Mea Shiloach here, and from there I want to go to the Sforno. The Sforno Mea Shiloach is 19th century, relatively modern, but even if we go back in history, Sforno is before number 9, not before. This is confusing. Okay, number 9. Okay, what this foreigner living in the 16th century says is that basically the problem with this idyllic society where everyone understands everyone and everyone's together and so forth has a lot going for it on the one hand, but on what does it have against it? And he says the absence of machloket, which is a highly paradoxical statement. The absence of dissent. Machloket is usually regarded as a bad thing. The sages say you have to flee from any place where there is machloket. Even if you lose your ability to earn a good living, if you want to settle in a town where you have a good job, but there is machloket in town, run from there. Now, that's the more classic view, right? But here, the Sforno says, unexpectedly, that machloket is what's missing here. Because what you have here is everyone agreeing on the idolatry of the present moment and the impossibility for an Avraham, for an individual to arise and think differently. So you have a sense of a political, almost like a political religious, what's the word I want? Everyone together, right? Homogeneity. There's another word. Monolith, thank you, something like that, where the more people think alike, the more it's impossible for any individual to think differently. Viz, what we now have. Now it divides up into certain different groups, but it's the mob mentality. Emerson writes about it, about the sense in which we are like ants. He actually uses the insect, a mob, and that's how we live. We choose our mob, right? We have that, but in that time there was no choosing. It was just one mob to belong to, and that makes the existence of an Avraham very difficult. Who is an echad? There can be no echad who is yifneh, who turns aside from the general ideology and is dissatisfied with it and looks for something else, wants to be more, once in some way. So that makes us appreciate perhaps even more the fact that Abraham did arise precisely out of this kind of civilization. And then there is the Hamik Davar. Hamik Davar, number 8. Thank you. Well, this is quite long. I'm just going to try to get the gist of it. The Hamik Davar, late 19th century, talks about two things. Two things were wrong here. One was that they all wanted to live together. Kibbutz echad, he calls it. Now, I really don't know if in any way he's referring to the existence of kibbutzim in Eretz Yisrael. I'm throwing it out because it's just, I think that the chronology is possible. There were kibbutzim. I could be completely wrong. But the point is, he doesn't like at all. He gives him the shivers. The idea of living together is against God's will. God said, Shirtzu ba'aretz, swarm. And he understands that very powerfully, more than we have said so far. He says it means traveling, covering space, going, spreading out, filling space through the world, never being satisfied to stay in one place, to move on and on and on. That is what God wants of human beings, to spread out in the world, to fill space. And they wanted all to live together. What was their purpose? And it turns out, if you carry on and look at the second passage there, that the purpose was in order to form a completely conformist society in which there'd be no dissenting voices, and clearly he's speaking in political terms now, in which Na'aseh lanu Shem, he understands as we will appoint powers and authorities who will make sure that no one leaves. You know, that this kibbutz is impregnable, is closed. It's a closed society. And that there is an observation tower in the middle of it from which the police can watch to check that no one actually ever emigrates from this place and thinks otherwise. You know, so the thinking and the movement in the world go together. And there is this suffocating sense then of a closed-in society. Echad actually in Aramaic means closed, for obvious reasons. You have two doors that close with one another, so they become echad. So echad means closed.
Sounds like a panopticon.
Say again?
Sounds like a panopticon.
Yeah, that's the word I wanted. Thank you. Panopticon. Yeah. Panopticon is Jeremy Bentham, 18th century, right? His model of a prison. The ideal prison would be one with an observation tower in the middle of it, and from which you could look down into the cell, the circular prison around, in which everyone is in their cell, and you can look down at them and watch them all the time. The great benefit of this was a very clever idea, a very diabolical idea, was that people begin to self-regulate their behavior, which is what we want of our wild children. Yeah, that they begin to self-regulate. They're unregulated, and this is in a sinister form. They'll begin to self-regulate because they're afraid of being watched. You know that so they'll begin to internalize the image of a watcher, of someone who's watching us, and they'll become good superego people. There's something deeply sinister about this for the Hamik Davar. He's very sensitive to it. To that kind of internalized watchtower.
Whose model of a prison is this?
His name is Jeremy Bentham. He was a philosopher, but clearly a social planner as well. Isn't that often regarded as the role of religion? You know, that's what Freud had to say about the role of religion, that's the observation tower, that's God watching us, and we're not free to do anything, and so we self-regulate. Right? That's the critique of religion. And the Hamik Davar is very averse to it. He doesn't want a religion like that. And he goes on to to make then an astonishing claim. He says, why are we told all these details about the fire, about the furnace and the bricks? Do we really need to know all this about it? It's this information, so not interesting to us. It's not information we can connect with. And then he says this, but this description of the furnace, we should associate, it's purely associative thinking. We should blur our eyes, block out the details, and realize that suddenly Abraham comes into view with his midrashic history, not in the text, only in midrash, that he was thrown into a fiery furnace. Now, first thought, you may think, oh, come on, this is a bit too much. Right? And yeah, it is. It's off the wall. But look what he does with it. He says this society was preparing the instruments that were necessary for suppressing dissent. And when the first great dissenter turned up, and that was Abraham, who walked around thinking to himself, Echad haya Abraham, right? That's what he's called he's called Echad. Not one who is everything, but one who is a solitary human being who wants to think, who wants to think to himself. That's how the Rambam described him. First years, he's walking around thinking to himself. He's not doing anything. He's not saying anything. He's not coming out with anything. He's just thinking. But he's already, the furnace is waiting for him. That's that. And in the end, it's used to burn bodies, to burn human beings. He actually says that. Now, this was extremely prescient in the time of the Hamic Davar, although, of course, he lived lived at a time when there were plenty of sinister regimes around, but it was before communism proper and before fascism proper. But he had a very live sense of this kind of menace, and that the whole story of the Tower of Babel is meant to inculcate in us a certain sense of the danger of this apparently benign situation in which everyone is talking the same language. Now, what's wrong with everyone talking the same language? Well, children talk a different language from adults, right? Children put things in their own way. They come home and make their own observations. Sometimes their sentences don't make sense unless you're prepared to blur your attention and actually listen to what they're saying. They are the rebels among us. They are the built-in dissidents among us, unregulated. They're the unregulated ones. And there's a sense there of a healthy family, a family in which there are these forces. Now, in the end, there has to be a certain kind of civilization. But what we need to start with is the possibility of an echad to survive and to do something in the world, to grow. In a uniform society, there's no space to grow. There's no space to be this. And with this, I want to make one last suggestion. Where we have just about 5 minutes. This migdal, yes. You can see on your page. Yeah. Number 10, Gemara and Sanhedrin. Amari Rabbi Yochanan, Migdal shlish nisrav, shlish nivla, shlish chayam. What happened to this tower? We don't hear anything about the tower. The city is destroyed. What about the tower? A third of it was burned. A third of it was swallowed up in the earth, sank into the earth, and a third of it still exists. Something survived at that tower. There was something workable there. And it was something to do with being a third. Not one, not two, but 3. And then Rav says, mysteriously, Avir Migdal Mishakeas. The atmosphere of a tower makes you forget. Creates amnesia. Makes you forget what? Rashi says, Et halimud. Et halamud. Makes you forget what you've learned. That is, if you are in the presence of a tower, and apparently you're supposed to imagine now people at the base of the tower, looking up at the tower, and somehow feeling dizzy. You look up at that sublime, powerful, overpowering peak at the top up there, which is observing you as well. And you look up and you forget everything you've learned. What are we talking about here? Well, many possibilities. But I want to take this move. The idea of forgetting one's learning. Terrible thing. It's something that happens to old people. Yes? And so the Gemara brings up, the Gemara in Brachot, Chet, brings up the possibility of Zaken sheshachach et limudo. An old person who forgets his learning. I find this is one of the terrors of old age. Yes, I notice it in myself and in other people. Yeah, you can fill it in for yourself. So somewhere there is that you should give honor to such a person. His learning has abandoned him, has left him. He's evacuated of the ability. Does it mean of all the contents, all the material that he knew? He doesn't remember all the details. Does it also mean he's forgotten what it is to learn? How to learn? And the assumption, I think, is with the Chachamim that he hasn't forgotten that. The understanding of how to learn, that intuitive sense of how you go about approaching an other and trying to see both the difference and the sameness between you, creates a third reality. And that is the learning you get out of it. Now, you get out something that connects you and that can nurture you. Now, what happens when the learning leaves? What's left is, this is Rav Hutner's comment, what's left is a roshem. Even when you've lost your learning, an imprint, a trace of what you knew is left. Maybe you get it not entirely right, you don't remember, is it the left or is it the right, you may mitbalbel, that maybe a certain amount of confusion, but you still have a grasp of what's not there. And the idea of when a righteous person leaves town, this is on Yaakov, Vayetze Yaakov, yes. When a righteous person leaves town, he leaves behind a roshem. He is no longer in the town, but in the town there is a roshem, there's an imprint, there's a trace of his absence. The fact that he was once here, so you go to the places where he was and you feel his absence. In other words, to become empty of something has left you, could still mean that you are living with the reality of what once was here. How does one learn language to start with? Jonathan Lear says this, and with this I'll finish. We think that at first we can't speak. It's one of the great achievements of human development to learn to speak. How do we do it? At first we can't speak, and then suddenly we find ourselves using words. There's this word and that word. Where do the words come from? Are we attaching words to things? How do we do that? How do we add words to things? All right, here is this table, and I suddenly use the word table. How does it work, that addition of one thing to another? And he says something that's very imaginatively very satisfying. He says this. He says the child at first is bathed in a kind of global experience of sounds and feels and sights and smells. And among the sounds, there's something that will eventually become words. But at first, it's just one big blur. And it's a happy experience of living in what he calls a loving field, from which language develops. Where language, people are always talking to him and talking to each other, but it's just part of the generality of things. And then what happens is that things begin to separate out. Nothing is added. On the contrary, that from that general mass of experiences, he begins to listen to the sounds, and the sounds begin to detach from each other. And suddenly one sound can be lifted out of the whole field and it's, oh, it's a word. And now you can use that word separately from the whole from which it came. Now that would be one part of the story. But then after that, there would need to be the possibility of using that word in many contexts. To be able to use that word and attach it to all kinds of, different situations of the object. And that means that in some way, you are, in a way, returning the word to the field after that. You're not just walking around hugging your word. You want it to be in some way then to reconnect you with other experiences. What happens when a language goes dead? And I want to suggest that that's the situation in the Torah Bava. That language goes dead. The Meir Shiloach actually says that, and it's in number 11. You can look at it yourselves. He says that maybe they spoke Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, because after all, that was the language in which the world was created. And if there's only one language, then presumably it would have been Hebrew. So formally it was Lashon HaKodesh, but it wasn't Lashon HaKodesh, because it had lost all that intuitive life of coming mishoresh hachayim, of coming from deep within a global sense of things, a larger intuitive sense of things, which give language life. We can feel when someone is talking in a live way, or the words really are slogans. That one is just mouthing what everyone is saying. That's a dead language. And so Jonathan Lear, who is a psychoanalyst as well as a philosopher, ends this by saying that's what the analyst tries to do, the psychoanalyst, when someone comes and speaks a dead language, comes and speaks in a way that doesn't have any life left in it. He tries to bring words back to life by in some way lifting a word from out of its context and letting it simmer. Let it now begin somehow the play, which is psychoanalysis, in some way to begin to question the word, to allow oneself to wonder about it. And then perhaps there is a sense of reviving something of that original, blissful, undifferentiated state, now with a sense both of differentiation, that there are particular words and there is such thing as grammar and syntax and all those conscious things. And at the same time, deeply, there is what Meir Shiloach interestingly calls Kedusha. He's talking about language, and he doesn't mean Kedusha in a formal sense, that it has to do with Shabbat, or he means Kedusha as a description of live language, of language which is connected with the deepest parts of us and can nevertheless go out and unite with other words, with other phenomena, in such a way as to create. Any immediate thoughts? If you have to leave. If you'd like to stay for a minute or two. Any immediate thoughts?
Creation at the beginning, the creation of language, because out of the tohu bohu fall the sound.
Yeah.
Of the word.
That's right. The tohu vavohu is that kind of emptiness, which is, it's full and it's really empty. It's too full.
The first thing that emerged in the tohu vavohu was Vayomer.
Is Vayomer, right? Which is the pulling out of it. Yeah.
I love the way you ended this share with the same way you started it with those two eyes.
Yeah.
Or from the
Oh, the two eyes, right?
blurring out
Yeah.
everything.
Avivah,
Yes.
my cup also is running over. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to tune out now. Thank you so much.
The voice from above has spoken.
The voice from Heart Sophim. Bye-bye.
Bless you.
Thank you. Thank you.